For inviting me. I've been interested in nitrogen for a long time, and it's been a long time since anyone else has because of the droughts in southern Australia. In fact, on our farm we've used not 1 gram of nitrogen fertiliser until this year. Remember that nitrogen fertiliser only provides about half of the nitrogen used by crops. The rest of it comes from mineralisation of the soil organic matter. So we're talking about a supplementation of that. In Australia, fertiliser only supplies about 1/3 of the nitrogen used by crops. So we have younger soils, they are less heavily depleted, and so we're in a better position. In the northern grains region, I suspect that it's getting more towards the international standard than that is in the south and the west. The committee wanted me to talk particularly about uptake pathways, and I guess they're driven by the changes in the last year, the sudden increase in demand for nitrogen because of the higher yield potentials. So this rather short-term interest contrasts a bit with the previous 2 talks, but I notice a few commonalities that I can think about with what Julian and Gordon have talked about. First is the price of fertiliser. That's going to determine a lot. And remember that fertilisers are basically commodities. They do attempt to, fertiliser manufacturers do tend to try to go towards the augmented products that Gordon talked about, but most of them are commodities that you can go onto the internet and find yourself a shipload of fertiliser and you can try to import it. And if you get it at a low price, you can say this is a much better product than the other guy's product, but you're still basically selling a commodity. In fact, Julian Cribb could give an equal talk to the one he gave to us, to the fertiliser manufacturers, and he could commiserate with them for the low prices that these poor people get for their fertiliser. Now, many of us will not agree with that, but I think that's the way they feel. The ratio of nitrogen price to grain price, for Australian grain anyway, sticks at about 6:1. The price per unit of the cheapest nitrogen, which is urea, is typically, over the last 50 years, about 6 times the price of grain. It does fluctuate when there's a spike in the grain price. The price of nitrogen spikes also, and vice versa. When the Chinese suddenly come into the market and buy a lot of urea, the urea price spikes and the grain price follows it. This is not caused, I think, by the invisible hand of the market, but by a smart fertiliser executive with a hand calculator who keeps that ratio at 6:1. So there are lots of products before we get on to the pathways. In the northern grains region, I think we're mostly stuck with pre-drilling and at-sowing applications of the basic products, the DAP and urea, perhaps some of these augmented products such as nitrification and urease inhibitors, but they will become commodities as well within the next few years or so. So I think the bread and butter involves DAP, urea and hydrous ammonia in this region, and then more expensive products, ammonium sulphate, liquid NNP, and the alternative products that I'll talk very briefly about. So the problem with these, of course, is that where they are pre-drilled, there's a tillage operation and winding back of our direct drilling. There's a delay while that process goes on. So I think as much as possible, 1-pass operations, between row bands of those top 3 products are there's sensible ways to go, so as not to delay, not to lose time. In the south and the west, we've found increasingly that a lot of the nitrogen decisions can be left until much later, till the start of stem elongation, up till about booting, and in extreme conditions up till flowering. I think urea, and to some extent side-banded ammonia, with good guidance is a real option for late applications of nitrogen. And I know some people in the north and a few people in the south are trying this innovation. Ammonium sulphate, again, very high priced, and again, alternative products, and the less said the better. Foliar spraying has come in for a variety of reasons. Again, it had a spike in usage about 30 years ago and went away, and you can mix your own urea if you're dedicated. I'll now get on to the features of the foliar products, and these are foliar as well as liquid. We've known about foliar uptake of nutrients for over 100 years. It was used and is used in soils, particularly in horticulture, where you can't get uptake of some nutrients because of some toxicity in the soil. The use of foliar nitrogen is somewhat younger. It sort of followed the use of reasonable sort of boom sprays and nozzles after the Second World War. And most of the basic research was done by the 1950s, and you can't find much literature on the basic work since the 50s. The field research was done on efficiency, and that was only in the last few years, and it's not very good, I must say. Throughout this talk, I'll be talking about efficiency, and for the most part, the efficiency of nitrogen is still pretty dismal. We have a long way to go with existing technologies and refinement of existing technologies. We have an even further way to go with good research on increasing the efficiencies. So I think there's easily a 50% improvement in efficiency of nitrogen that can be obtained with research and development, and I would greatly support what Julian Cribb had to say about the need for that sort of work, and this is just an example of that. The old research that we dug up for this, and I must say this was pretty interesting looking at it, the work that was reported in the 50s and before. Leaves do take up all forms of inorganic nitrogen that has been tested, and they take up urea a bit better than ammonium and a bit better than nitrate. And that seems to be pretty well, had been established by the 50s. It comes through the cuticle, it doesn't go through the stomates. It's a slower process, I guess, than root uptake, but it still proceeds because there's a lot of leaf area. Now, all forms of foliar nitrogen can burn the foliage, but the reports are inconsistent. We had an attempt at doing this sort of work about 30 years ago, and we were quite worried about burning of foliage, and we took the unusual step of reading the label, and it was just right. No burning if you do what the label says. The uptake of foliar nitrogen is highly variable from 0 to 100%. I'll show you a few examples of 0% recovery in the field. Where you see values of 100%, the first thing you do is disbelieve them. But in one example, I know the person did the work, it was a PhD in the 50s, and I'm sure it was perfect. She did it with a hand atomizer, and she's prevented any of the foliar nitrogen dropping off the leaves onto the ground, and she got 100% recovery. So it's possible to get 100% recovery, but in the real world, it's never going to happen because there's going to be the foliar nitrogen is going to flick off the leaves in the wind and evaporate, and so I think my guess is that it's still about the same as you'll get from other fertiliser, about 50% recovery in the plant, when you look at all the data that's been collected. Wetters improve the uptake. Interesting work that came from Angus Alston about 30 years ago, that the foliar uptake increases when the soil is wet. So one of the reasons that we think about foliar nitrogen is that it can be applied when there isn't a wet soil or there isn't a rain coming. Well, that appears to be a bit optimistic to believe that, and I think that you get the best results of foliar nitrogen uptake when the whole plant is very wet. It's interesting that independent of the amount that actually gets taken up, it comes in pretty fast through the leaves. What's coming in will come in pretty fast, and so you'll get a greening up effect. So it tends to advertise itself. And another result was that foliar nitrogen uptake stimulates root uptake of other nutrients. Now we know that when you apply nitrogen to the soil, that you'll get the accompanying cation going into the plant with the nitrate. So you'll get the potassium and magnesium and calcium and so forth going in with it. Well, that also happens when you apply that as a foliar. So there's a stimulating effect there. Some soil aspects of foliar application. If you add a liquid, if you spray a liquid, it's only a proportion that hits the leaves. Most of it is probably going to hit the soil, and so it's no different from a solid fertiliser. If it's urea, it'll be converted to ammonium with urease, and the urease is typically present in greatest concentrations in trash. So that applying urea to a stubble will rapidly take it to ammonium. Then you'll go to ammonia, particularly with alkaline soils, which I think we're looking at mostly here. And then you'll get volatilisation, and if there's wind, you'll lose it. But if there's a thick canopy, if there's 3 or 4 or 5 times more plants than I've got there, you can get uptake of gaseous ammonia by the leaves. So a lot of the high recoveries of urea that we see applied at flowering, I think, are due to recovery of ammonia by the leaves, by the thick canopies. So applying nitrogen to a thick canopy is probably a much more efficient way if you can manage it with late applications. A bit more background. The timing of nitrogen increases grain protein if it's applied late, and that can come from deep subsoil mineral nitrogen or late foliar spray or late urea. If you do get a wet spring, as we got last year, but then if it dries off, there is much more chance of haying off if the nitrogen is applied early. So that haying off is not normally a problem in this region because you don't have the yield potentials, but if you're heading for a 5 or 6 or 7 tonne yield and then it goes dry, then you can get haying off if there's high nitrogen status. Remember also that you can lose nitrogen from the leaves as ammonia or liquid, or from the roots possibly. Now the conclusion by the mid-50s was that given all that, it seems unlikely that foliar applications is useful. But Professor Boynton, who made this conclusion, also said that there might be exceptions. So are there exceptions in this region? In all cases, liquids are more convenient. They're more costly to buy and more costly to transport because there's a lot of water. On the other hand, you use existing spray carts, and because we will tend to use it infrequently in this region, the use of existing equipment is probably a good idea. And on the other hand, we may have less nitrogen loss and higher efficiency. So let's look at the evidence of that. Here's some work we did 30 years ago. Ammonium nitrate and urea ammonium nitrate. There's the yield responses and there's the grain protein responses. They're in the book. And the apparent nitrogen recovery, the efficiency if you like, was a little less with the urea ammonium nitrate, but I would think it was not significantly so. I looked for some more research more recently in the literature, and some work in Oklahoma. I put them there to show the results you often get with low rates of nitrogen applied. It's very hard to measure the efficiency. You're subtracting one large number from another large number, and you get these crazy efficiencies, 96%, 95%, and then they suddenly drop to 32. So I would suspect these are erroneous data. And I think they didn't report that. If you go back to the journal, you won't find those numbers there. But if you calculate them, you'll find that they've done something very strange. Another US project was in South Dakota. They put UAN on at booting or anthesis and got no effect on the nitrogen uptake, and the apparent recovery was effectively zero. So that's a common result. What they did wrong, I can't imagine, but it's a common result where that sort of work's done. The best and I think most relevant bit of work was done by some colleagues in Victoria and South Australia on an alkaline soil, top dressing at different dates between stem elongation and flowering. We haven't distinguished between the dates, but what we've done is expressed it at the recovery percentage in relation to the rainfall in the week after top dressing. And you find only 10 or 12% of the urea nitrogen recovered with no rain, and twice that amount of ammonium nitrate. Now, you might think that's, and you'd expect ammonium nitrate to have a similar efficiency to urea ammonium nitrate, to a foliar. The point is that's not relevant. You shouldn't be applying top dressing or spraying with no rain expected. If you go up to 50 millimetres of rain expected, you're getting about a 30% recovery. This is 30% recovery in the grain, so you'll get about 40% recovery in the whole plant. Whereas here, you're getting 40% recovery with 2 inches of rain in the week after application, and that would go up to 50%. So that's the sort of result you'd expect in good conditions with rain expected. Now, should you or your clients buy a spreader and then with the expectation of leaving it in the shed for most years, or use a boom spray with liquid? So I just got the probability of exceeding rainfall targets in the 2 months before anthesis. Say for Goondiwindi, you'd expect about 1 year in 4 to get you 100 millimetres in those 2 months. Whereas in the south, you'd expect twice that. 1 year in 2, you'd expect to get a good rainfall amount mid-season that would encourage top dressing or foliar sprays. So we've got to balance the cost of dearer liquids and an existing machine, a spray rig, compared with a solid fertiliser, which is cheaper, urea, which is cheaper, and buying a spreader. And so a spreader like that, you can get those on iHub for probably $5,000 second hand, or you can go up to the full best machine with load cells and variable rates, and you pay $25,000 for them, $27,000. So I did a spreadsheet to try and balance those two costs. Urea ammonium nitrate with a boom spray, urea with a spinner, machinery costs estimated by the usual ways, and then we said, let's assume that urea ammonium nitrate varies up to 30% more than nitrogen in urea. Now, at reasonably high rates, at 50 kilos per hectare, urea is cheaper as the price is relatively cheaper as the price goes up to the existing premiums you pay. If the price of nitrogen and urea ammonium nitrate is 20 or 30% more than the price of nitrogen in urea, you're better off with urea. At very low rates, it doesn't matter a lot. You can choose either. So as the price goes up, you're better off to use urea and buy a spreader and park it in the shed for 3 years out of 4. Now, remember that these are products being marketed, they're commodities being marketed, and what the vendor wants is not always exactly what the buyer wants. They can buy cheap product and advertise it as being an augmented commodity, to use Gordon's term, And also small resellers find liquids easier to handle than solids. So there are reasons for vendors favouring liquids. Brief comment about alternatives. I'm not courageous enough to make a comment about individual products because of the chance of litigation. There's a lot of strange advertising methods, and I don't think there's any point in testing a lot of these products, because if a product's discredited, it'll be replaced by others pretty smartly. So you can do a calculation of how much nitrogen is required. It's the same sort of calculation you use for at-sowing applications. You say your target yield, target protein, convert that to nitrogen, assume an efficiency of 50%, assume that 90% of the fertiliser goes into grain. So the method for calculating is just the usual way of an efficiency, and the real difference is that there's less nitrogen goes into the straw. Conclusions: late application of nitrogen fertiliser is a useful tactic for unusually wet seasons in this region. Liquids are expensive, convenient products, but you can save on a machine. Their efficiency is probably greater than urea on alkaline soils, but otherwise on neutral or acid soils probably no different. Liquid nitrogen fertilisers should be considered at low application rates, or if the price or the premium is no more than 15% more than urea. But remember, most importantly, remember the basics of nitrogen. Apply it to crops with adequate nitrogen demand, so we shouldn't think only of the supply of nitrogen, but the demand for nitrogen, and that usually involves low root disease or no root disease risk. And then the other one is to estimate the nitrogen supply that's already been received by the crop, and a shoot density test is probably the most convenient way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. The variability in recovery of nitrogen in the plant from what you apply, does it depend on whether the plant actually needs nitrogen or not as much as it does the application and environment that's applying? So if you can get perfect application conditions, if the plant doesn't actually is sufficient for nitrogen at that point, is it still going to take it up?
Absolutely. I think that's probably the main reason that a lot of the early research in Australia was done on nitrogen supply, and I think more of it should be on demand. And so applying nitrogen to a small plant inevitably means that there'll be a long time before it's taken up. So the safest place for nitrogen fertilisers is under the soil, but if it's on the soil surface, it should be rained in, and if it's on a large plant, it'll be taken up pretty quickly within a week or so. And if you spray a nitrate product onto a plant, it'll go in within a few days. But the losses are a symptom of looking at it in a supply term. But I think what you're saying is right, that thinking about the demand of a healthy plant that is no root diseases and a fairly large plant means that it'll be taken up quickly and you'll get higher efficiency.